Welcome everybody to the VLOGAN, a vlog for individuals with special needs and those who love them. I'm so excited today to have my guest, Lauren Sabo. Her website is studentlawOhio.com. I think that says it all. She is an advocate for students and parents in education and does a lot of different things and somehow does them all well. She is an attorney who represents students and parents. She is an author, wrote a book called Special Education Law in a Nutshell, that talks about federal law and is available across the country and on Amazon. She is also a law school professor at Moritz College of Law at Ohio State and teaches special education advocacy. Boy, Lauren, what a busy life you must have. And so I'm so grateful that you took some time today to speak with me and my viewers. Lauren, your website is actually studentlawOhio.com. So student law can mean a lot of different things to different people. Can you just kind of tell us what it is to be a student lawyer?
Sure, yeah. Well, I come from a background as an educator. So I was a high school multi-intensive special education teacher. So that was my first career before I joke retiring from that and then going to law school. And I went to law school to do this exact work. So when I was in the classroom, I just felt like, my hands were kind of tied as a teacher in terms of certain advocacy and services for young people and especially young people with disabilities, since that is, the majority of my focus, although I do work with really any student, pre-K through PhD. Yeah, Student Law Ohio. Gosh, I've had my firm for 4 years now, which is really exciting. But this is the space that, I knew I wanted to go to Logan after law school. And so that's, the focus I've had. But really, I do student and parent side representation. So that means, when students have an issue at school. So again, oftentimes my clients are students with disabilities, although there are other types of education related issues that I do, like Title IX, bullying, harassment. I represent a couple small schools, small private schools, and I help do their compliance work, which is really fun and exciting. But most of my cases are, disability related advocacy for students. Again, as young as, littles, preschool, or even honestly before they're even entering preschool, and if they need services, and then all the way through, students in, middle school, high school, college, and then ultimately, PhD programs, students in law school, and I help do things in higher ed, like get accommodations for students, but also we do representation, for example, for students who are looking to get in-state tuition, and so
Okay.
they get denied. Our focus again is all student related. But gosh, at this point, I feel like kind of anything and everything that touches education and special education we do, and then we will do some um, educator representation as well. I just say we don't promote that as much just because I love really working with kids. But I do have another attorney who's also a former high school teacher, and he does, a little bit more educator representation. So it kind of runs the gamut.
Awesome. So you've had your own firm for 4 years, but you've been involved in representing students for how long?
Gosh, this is going on 7 years, is that right? Yeah,
Okay.
since, but essentially, yeah, my entire career has always been student. So if you add in teaching and all of that, right, 15 plus years of doing student advocacy type work.
Okay, awesome. So I'd love to focus just in on the special needs portion of your practice because, as you know, I'm a special needs estate planning attorney. So the only people I see are parents, grandparents, sometimes siblings, but mostly parents of a child with a disability. And we're doing planning for that child, from cradle all the way up to their adulthood, making sure that they've got the right benefits, making sure that we plan for them when parents pass away. Perhaps we're transitioning out of the house. Um, so I do get a lot of questions about education, and I always say that's not something I do.
Yep.
People hear lawyer. A lot of times people think courtroom. I-
Right.
Is that where you do most of your work in the courtroom?
It is not, Logan. I do end up in court on occasion. So I say, a couple times a month. Although after law school, I was a public defender. So, have spent a lot of time in court. But in terms of my education, special education work, no, we're really working with the school. So normally I end up in schools, right? So, of course, with Zoom and technology, we can do things all across the state now and not have to drive places and be able to have meetings a lot faster with school teams. And sometimes, we do have to get the Department of Education involved or bring in a mediator or facilitator, which are great options for families too. And we can talk more about that since it is a free option with the state that I recommend to families all the time if they're having tension, right, or having an upcoming meeting that maybe both sides are not seeing eye to eye in terms of services or accommodations for students. But yeah, so I'm in court a few times a month, but most of the time that's because my clients, something happened in school and they got in trouble. So typically, I do a lot of work in the suspension expulsion realm. And then
Yeah.
what that means is, unfortunately, oftentimes, these young people are also picking up juvenile criminal charges for whatever happened in school. And so I will do both, meaning I will get everything, worked out with the school and represent the student in the school piece and work with the school's attorney and team on that. And then ultimately also, go into court and represent the student there since, sometimes my job is educating the court and helping them understand too why maybe a student with a disability, might have engaged in a certain way or, not engaged in a certain way or gotten themselves in a little bit of trouble.
So, what's a situation where you represent a person who doesn't feel like the school is doing what they should be doing, what their child needs? And I know you mentioned mediation. So, can you kind of maybe talk us through from beginning to end, sort of a process of, hey, my child's not getting what I think they should be getting,
Yeah.
and then what are parent options, and then where do you get involved?
Sure. Yeah, so I say just because special education law is a rather niche field, and there aren't a lot of teachers who become attorneys, but there are a handful of us out there, but then not a lot that then do education or special education law. And so, oftentimes by the time families are coming to us, they really have been struggling for a while, honestly. They've kind of tried in their minds all the different things, communicating, going to meetings. On occasion, they'll even have maybe even brought in a facilitator or mediator, although, that's not something that the school necessarily is telling families about, although they can because both parties do have to agree if they want to bring in a special education facilitator or mediator. And again, that's a free program through the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce. And it's online. We can throw a link there so that families have it.
Great.
Basically, you as a family, I always tell families, I'm happy to request this. And I do request it for families when I feel like we need it. But again, you do not need an attorney to request a facilitator or a mediator. If your child either has an IEP or is kind of in the process of getting an IEP, and maybe there's disagreement if the child would qualify under the IDEA for an IEP. So that's kind of the funding that the state has, meaning there's not funding for these facilitators and mediators to come to a 504 plan meeting.
Okay, so I want to make sure so mediator to me sounds like somebody who helps people come to a decision.
Mhm.
Facilitator means maybe something, but then I also hear the word advocate. And I heard you say that mediator has to be agreed to.
Yep.
Does facilitator and advocate have to be agreed to?
Great question. So, mediator and facilitator sometimes we use interchangeably when it comes to special ed law, mainly just because those people, there's a list that the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce has, and they've all been vetted. Some of those people are attorneys, some are not, but they all have a background in mediation and facilitation. So essentially, being the middle person, right, on with both sides and helping, like you said, the parties to kind of get to an agreement or just get to the heart of the matter. Sometimes that's the issue is maybe the school's not really understanding the parent's perspective or what the child really needs. So those people are trained to do both, meaning facilitate and mediate. The main difference is that a facilitator in that role, they would just come to an IEP meeting or an evaluation team report meeting, that ETR meeting you might hear if you're in the initial stages. of an IEP, or every 3 years, we have to have kids have to get reevaluated to continue to be on IEPs. So they can come to those meetings and they really just help set the agenda and help both sides communicate as a facilitator, right? So they are running the meeting in the sense, and I will say, I think from the parent perspective and what I hear and what I experience when I'm a part of these meetings, is it just kind of feels better when it's not the school team running a meeting if there has been some contention, right? Or maybe some disagreements. It just feels better when you have a neutral party who knows special education and the law and kind of how to, navigate this facilitation to be the one running the meeting, right? So it's not the school team anymore, kind of talking maybe at the parent, although I know that's not the goal of school teams, right? But sometimes that's how it feels from the parent perspective. And so a mediator, if they're in that role, that just means that they are going to be essentially creating an agreement at the end of the meeting. Instead of just signing an IEP where everybody's agreeing to that IEP, there might be some other components that are an issue. And so they're actually creating almost like a contract agreement. And that's where the mediation comes in because, again, it would be confidential, kind of all of those things that, maybe you and I would know about court wise in terms of mediation, but it's actually available for families for special education. And again, facilitator, still both parties have to agree to have that person come to the meeting. It's just they're going to come to the meeting and really just kind of help be the setting the agenda and helping the conversation. A mediator is going to really try to get to the heart of the issues to get more of like a written agreement at the end.
Awesome. And then how about an advocate?
Sure. So an advocate would be somebody that parents or families or parents, guardians, whoever are hiring, typically privately, although there are a couple organizations out there that do the work pro bono. And so oftentimes when you hear advocate, that is going to be a non-attorney who has some sort of background, maybe training, although there's no national training or anything that they have to have in order to be an advocate. So oftentimes advocates are, community members, maybe parents who had issues with their own kiddos and just felt like, wow, that really was challenging. So they now help other parents. And again, sometimes counties will have like a parent liaison advocate that is free. So I always say like worth asking about. And then other times parents would be hiring an advocate, again, as a non-attorney to come to IEP meetings to help maybe review documents in advance and come advocate right for that student.
Okay.
The main difference though is they cannot give legal advice, right?
Okay, you asked something or you said something there worth asking about. So
Yeah.
are they asking the school about that, or are they asking friends and family? Are they calling you to ask about that?
Sure. It could be any of the above. We do have two non-attorney special education advocates on our team, and so those would be paid privately. They obviously are billed at a lower rate than an attorney. And so sometimes when I get cases, that's all they need. The family really just needs somebody to kind of come to these meetings who has a background in special ed, knows what we call the alphabet soup, right? IEP, 504, FBA. BIP, there's all these terminologies out there in special ed that, if you're a family and your child is just, getting into these services, you might not know all of that. So that's really the role of the advocate is to come to meetings. Again, my advocates both have backgrounds. One's a speech language pathologist and professor and, has been in schools her entire career and is a clinician. And then the other actually just graduated from law school, although he's doing one more year to get an LLM in tax, since he's actually interested in special needs estate planning as well and a few other things. But he's a PhD school psychologist, right?
Okay.
So, I,
Wow.
yeah, so they have wonderful backgrounds and have been doing this, their entire careers in terms of working with schools and kids and families and IEPs. Um, but sometimes that's why I always say in terms of if you're reaching out to an advocate, you want to ask their credentials, you want to ask how many meetings they've gone to, how just kind of their I say like kind of their tone and their attitude towards schools in the sense of some advocates are very collaborative, others are a little more assertive, and so you have to find one that fits for you. Although I also say at the end of the day, you want somebody who's going to advocate for your child, but who also does understand, what your child and you as a family can and can't have under the law, right? Because sometimes there is a disconnect in legally what the school's providing and maybe what parents want. But the reality is sometimes what the school's providing based on the law is actually what the law says, is okay.
Okay. So an advocate can be anyone that a parent wants to bring.
Yep, exactly. And legally, in terms of an IEP team meeting, right? Obviously, the school has certain people that they have to bring, right? So they always have. I will say the exception is unless the parent, signs a form that says it's okay that certain X person isn't there. And on occasion things come up, but in general, they need to have a special education teacher, they need to have a general education teacher, typically somebody who can kind of review reports and be kind of in charge of that role of helping the family understand. Oftentimes that would be the school psychologist in kind of those initial meetings, but it might be a case manager, an intervention specialist, a school principal. So my point is there are required team members under the law, but for families, really, the parents are a huge part of that team. So I always say to schools, and clients, you never want to miss an IEP meeting, right? Meaning, I never want a school to hold an IEP meeting without a parent or guardian present. But also on the flip side, I don't want, a parent to have the school, be talking about their kid without them present.
Hmm.
So, if we need to rearrange schedules, if a date doesn't work, that's okay. I would rather have, a meeting get changed and have it work for everybody than, go to a meeting without all the right people there. And a big part of an IEP team meeting, Logan, that I think it's lost sometimes, and I'm always encouraging, again, schools and families, is having that student present. And, I say it doesn't mean that they have to be there for the whole meeting, right? Because again, some parts of the meeting maybe, are just things that we wouldn't want them missing class for, or a little more contentious. But in general, my rule of thumb, just from being a teacher and in my experience, is I really think by the time kids are in third grade, they really have a pretty good idea of what's going on. Again, this it's really unique to each student, but even a kindergarten or a second grader, sometimes I just do a quick little video of them, asking them questions about school, and we play that at the start of the meeting. And the reason being is just because I want everybody to remember why we're all here, and it's for that child. Um,
Love that.
yeah, and I used to do that as a teacher too. So that's not necessarily like a true attorney strategy. It's just something, my rule of thumb was I always had the parent or guardian there, or, and I should say the student as well. And then for foster kids, there's actually a role called a uh, surrogate parent, and those are community members. Again, they do not have to be attorneys, they don't have to be teachers, just any community member who wants to be trained and do this volunteer role. And basically, schools have a list of surrogate parents. And if it's a foster kiddo, of course, we want foster parents there if they're engaged in this kid's life. But legally, those people actually should not be the ones signing the documents. It really should be the surrogate parent who gets the documents in advance, gets to review them, and then comes and essentially advocates on behalf of that young person who's in foster care.
Interesting. I mean, I bet we could do a whole show on a whole vlog on foster care IEPs. So tell me, I've heard something that says that if a parent gets a lawyer to come to an IEP meeting, the school is going to bring their lawyer or won't meet without their lawyer present. I'm going to ask that question. So is that true? And then B, do they have to tell the school that they're bringing a lawyer to the meeting ahead of time?
Great questions. Yes. So that is true. I would say in my work, like 90% of the time, right? So meaning 90% of the time, if you're going to get an attorney, to be able to represent your kiddo and go to meetings, then yes, the school is 90% of the time going to bring their attorney, right?
And you just said, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but you said represent their kiddo. Is that who you represent, the child, or do you represent the parents?
Yeah, really good question. So technically, the child or student, right? I mean, if they're 18, again, depending on their guardianship or whatever they have in place, the child, the student is actually my client. So of
Okay.
course, we work hand in hand with parents, right? Again, when we're meeting with parents, we also are including the kiddo, right? So we want to work as a team, but at the end of the day, yeah, the kid is actually the client for us.
Okay, awesome. Thanks. So
Yep.
now back to your 90% of the time. Thank you.
Yeah. So 90% of the time, schools do bring their attorney. There are some schools, that just they know me, they know the reputation. And so, sometimes their teams are like, honestly, we know Lauren's background, we know she's great. So they don't bring their attorney, right? Because they just feel like, hey, we know that this is going to go well. I always send an agenda in advance because I never want to have surprises on either side, right? There's just no real reason when it comes to special education to surprise each other. If the parents, if we're asking for certain things for that student, I'm going to tell the school in advance because I also want them to have the right people there at the meeting to either, say yes, or potentially no, or here's how we can work this out. But the point is, right, like I don't want to surprise school teams and have them be scrambling or have to say, oh, we have to go check with so and so, we have to get back to you, right? If I go to a meeting, I want it to be as productive as possible, so I'm
Love
going
that.
to send an agenda in advance. And again, that is not a lawyer strategy. That's just something I did when I was a teacher too, and it just can be so effective. And again, you don't need a lawyer to do that, right?
I love that. So it sounds to me like it's when you're involved, okay, it's collaborative and
Mhm.
it's almost to quote Roadhouse, right? You're nice until it's time to not be nice, right? So what is that? And like, what's I hear the words and I can't think of them right now that I hear, okay, we're going to go to court because of something. We're going to argue something. And what is that?
Yeah, that's probably what you're referring to as due process.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
Yep. And so it's interesting. So again, there are multiple different complaint processes, right, that you can go through if you have an issue, with special education and services. In terms of that, there's a couple different pathways, either with the Ohio Department of Education and Workforce and the state, or with the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, and that would be more of a disability related kind of complaint. And both do great work, right? I worked at the U.S. Department of Education in Washington, D.C. when I was in law school. So, that was a wonderful experience. I will say, though, that it's a federal agency. And so it's a little slow right now, right? And they're doing their best. But outside of that, in terms of special education, your kind of administrative option as a parent, if it is just not working and you feel like the school is just not doing what you believe is right for your child, and what we typically see complaints for is FAPE, right? A denial of FAPE. And that's that, again, alphabet soup, but free, appropriate, public education. And so, this is specific to public schools. And so I want to just be really clear because private schools in general do not have to follow the IDEA, those IEPs that kids have, in the same way that a public school does. Now, there obviously are some fabulous private schools out there that really just work with kids with disabilities, right? So every single kid at their school has, whether it's a true IEP or ISP, individualized service plan, something like that. But again, in general, private schools are a little bit immune from some of those laws. And so they don't even have to accept, kids with disabilities sometimes. And so that
Okay.
makes it challenging if you're choosing to send your kid to a private school, right? Meaning you're limited on the type of complaints and things that you can file. But if you're in a public school, then what you actually, before going to court, typically, again, 95% of the types of things you'd be complaining about, parents would actually have to file something called due process with the state. And I say it essentially looks like a mini court document, right? I mean, again, you don't need an attorney to do this, although you want it to have facts. You want it to have, the law in it, the issues, and then ultimately at the end they ask you to put, what you want as the resolution. What would get this resolved for you and your family and your child? And so once you file that, then there's a process and there's, certain number of days the school has to respond. They have to have a meeting to kind of try to get it resolved and see what the family wants. But in general, that is what families essentially have to do under the law before they would file in court. So if you don't file due process, then sometimes if you just try to go to court, they're going to say you didn't exhaust due process. You didn't exhaust the administrative remedy that the law says under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act says that you have to do first. Again, there's
So
a
just
couple claims that you could go to court first, but in general, most special ed claims, you do have to exhaust due process.
got it. Just because we are two lawyers talking, I want to make sure that I'm clear on what things are. So when you say you have to exhaust your administrative options, so what that means, I think, is that there's a system in place through the Department of Education that says if you have a problem with your child's education,
Mhm.
you need to go through this silo. We have something set up so that maybe we can resolve this without going to court.
Yep, that's
And
exactly right.
only when you finish here and it doesn't work out can you go over to court.
Yep, that's exactly right. Again, for most special ed claims, that's how it's going to have to happen, right? Which is challenging because so in general at my firm, we try not to file complaints, right? We try not to have to go to due process just because we know all the attorneys that represent schools. We have good rapport with them, and like you said, we collaborate and we really try to get it worked out for everybody because due process can be very, very costly. And the reason being is because, again, you have to bring in expert witnesses, right, and pay these people.
So there's a hearing with due process.
There's a due process hearing. So you have
Is that
some,
the first time there is a hearing from somebody who has what would we call controlling authority to make a decision?
yep, unless you were going through kind of a different process with the school, like an internal grievance or something, and going through their superintendent and their board, which is an option too, right? It's just internal, so the school kind of has a policy and process around that. But yes, this would be kind of your first time that you get to be in front of a hearing officer. Again, the school's going to have their attorneys. And they'll have typically their school attorneys, and then oftentimes they will actually also have their insurance attorneys as well. So, tell parents, don't be surprised if there's two, three, or four attorneys showing up, right, for the school. Again, just because that's kind of the process and the way it works. But again, the goal with all of that is you can mediate all throughout the stages essentially of due process. And so, if you can come to a resolution without having to go to that hearing, again, normally that is best, just because I say the hearing is not in court, right? But it essentially looks like court, meaning there is somebody called an IHO, an impartial hearing officer, and they get to write a decision at the end of the hearing once they get all the facts, right? And have heard from both sides, and all the witnesses have been, questioned. It just doesn't take place in court, but we would prep for it just like court. It typically just takes place at like a board office or a local library in a conference room.
Wow.
Hmm.
Okay. So let's suppose that we go through this scenario. We've met with the teen,
Hmm.
and the parent has become frustrated. And
Yep.
the parent brings in an advocate. They don't have to ask for permission to do that, and they do that. But then the school and the parents agree to a mediator or facilitator. They mediate, can't come to a resolution.
Yep.
They bring you in at that point generally, or are you there for the mediation too sometimes?
You know, oftentimes I wouldn't, if they have an advocate already, typically, then they're saying, hey, the advocate, we want to move to an attorney, right? And so my point is, it's very rare that an advocate and, being paid and an attorney would be coming to a meeting, just because again, you're kind of then double getting paid there, or having to shell out twice as much. So oftentimes it is either kind of a handoff where they're like, hey, we've taken it this far, and either we can't do the legal piece or we don't know how, or, we would feel more comfortable having an attorney do this work. But oftentimes I actually do get involved kind of way, back up, either before a parent has even hired an attorney. Sometimes they just say, hey, we really like, your firm's background and, the way that you operate, right? We think that you can get this resolved without having to go. Again, it's not that I never get a facilitator or mediator. There's some really wonderful ones out there, who,
You sometimes serve as that facilitator or mediator almost, don't you?
I do. Yep, exactly. And usually
Because
the
you're able to say to the
attorney,
parents, look, this is what you're asking for. They
mhm,
don't legally have to do.
right?
Or you go to the school and say, hey, listen, they're not asking for that much.
Exactly.
You sometimes do that. So
Yep.
and then sometimes do people just even come to see you, spend an hour with you, just saying, okay, I've never been to an IEP meeting. I want to know what this is like. They do that too, right? You can
We do.
consult. Okay.
Yep, we do consultations, and we do typically charge for those for 1 hour, but families can send along the ETR in advance or the IEP, or if they have something, hey, I want you to review this. So we're happy to look at that. And then we do always hold X amount of slots a month for what we call community consults. And so that is just with myself or my other attorney. Um, and it's free, right? So the goal is we just understand that sometimes you can't pay to hire an attorney, and even like you said, just an hour of sitting down with somebody with the expertise to help go through your specific situation. I think webinars are wonderful. There are great resources out there, but when it comes specifically to your child or children, we really want to have that kind of attorney-client privilege and confidential conversation during a consult. And so we meet with families, in our office. We meet virtually, over the phone. Some just say, "Hey, I just want to, jump on the phone for an hour to do those consults." And again, sometimes it's just helpful for parents to have an hour of dedicated time to really talk through, and we talk through all the different options. And again, things that they can do without an attorney, right? If they haven't gotten to that point yet, hey, why don't you try this? Here's how I would, write that email, right? Because sometimes it's just changing the language a little bit to kind of get the school to initiate something on their end.
So let's suppose that we go through the mediator, still no resolution. Then we're talking about due process, Ohio Department of Education with an independent hearing officer
Mhm.
who writes a decision
Yep.
and it goes the parent's way.
Mhm.
Awesome.
Sure.
Is the school able to appeal that?
Yeah.
And do they? And where does
Um,
it go?
That's a good question. So, they can, and the fact is that oftentimes, by the time we get to that place, one, we try not to get to that place again. When the attorneys are involved, I do think, sometimes parents say, well, if I get an attorney, will the school retaliate against me? And, in my experience, I say that is not my experience, right? When I get involved in a case. And again, I think the reason is just because of my background, because I do this work, and all the schools really know me, and oftentimes our referrals are actually coming from schools. They're coming from superintendents, coming from school attorneys, because they actually would rather have families who are upset be represented, right? And then come into a meeting with knowledge, with, again, that agenda, really having a really clear ask of what we're looking for that student, versus kind of not honestly, right? So I feel very blessed that that's how we actually get a lot of our clients. Is we really do no marketing. We just it's kind of all word of mouth, and oftentimes it's actually schools that are referring us to families, even though they know that we're going to be on the opposite side
Mhm.
and advocating for that child. So it can be appealed. I would say no, most of the time that's not usually what's happening. On the rare occasion you will see special education cases go up to the United States Supreme Court. It is not
Is
that
that
common.
is that where they would go, or is it common pleas court then when
Yeah,
after
first you would take it through common pleas, and you'd have to go up, the courts in Ohio, and then ultimately, like I said, it's rare that it would get to the U.S. Supreme Court, but on occasion cases do, and that's how we get changes in the law. Which is wonderful. I think though, in general, because the interesting thing about special education and due process is that it's really going to be specific to that child. Meaning, as much as so many families tell me and students say, I want this changed for other kids too, right? I don't want other families to have to go through that. And that's wonderful. And if there's things that we can do, 100%, we try to do them, meaning, trainings, policy changes. There's a lot of things that we can do sometimes in a case to also get changes made it a bit of a more like systemic um, group, I guess. But in general, for due process, it's just going to be about that kid. And
Mhm.
so my point is, what's hard is that, other times when the law changes, it's for, a whole group of people. But for special education, most of the time, that hearing officer and the decision is just going to be specific to that child, that IEP, those services, the denial of FAPE. And so my point is, it's very costly. And again, you're only getting something for your child, and it could take, especially if you go to court, the court route, it could take years. So what I
Mhm.
find is sometimes when families do go to court, their child is actually graduated by the time it gets resolved, right?
Mhm.
And it's very costly. So that's why you're not going to see a ton of these types of cases really going to court. One, because you have to exhaust your administrative, remedy, which is due process, and that is costly too for families. And then two, because, even if you do that, then you get to court, and in general, courts are not super student friendly, right? So again, it's specific to that one child. They want to give schools a lot of kind of discretion, and so it is pretty hard for families in terms of kind of taking it to court and kind of winning this big win, if that makes sense.
So what I'm hearing is, generally speaking, the furthest things are going to go is that due process hearing in front of an independent hearing officer.
Yep.
And by that time, and usually it doesn't go there because we've had a resolution,
Mhm.
um, or sometimes parents get so frustrated they leave the district, right? Like, hey, we're going to go someplace else where it's not as exhausting. Because I know for my clients, there is so much more than school going on that they have to be an advocate for. There's just so much on the parents that I help, which is why I love what I do. I can take that one piece away from them. But to be advocating for Social Security money, to be advocating, well, let me excuse me, for SSI generally, advocating for SSI, advocating for the benefits that they need and the supports they need in the community and during the summer and that
Yep.
waiver. Then to have to also advocate in the school, it's just so much that I know that parents sometimes choose where they're going to live based on the school system, knowing
Yep.
that they're not going to have to do that kind of fight.
Yep, exactly. Yeah, it is. It's so hard. And I always say, like, the problem is that impartial hearing officer, in their decision under the law, they can only, give parents so much. Meaning sometimes, we want to be creative and do something for a child that, again, maybe the law doesn't say that, you have to do, but maybe a school is willing to do, and that would be best for that child. But again, sometimes an impartial hearing officer can't order that, right? So it is really hard. Can they order reimbursement of attorney's fees? Yes. So we can ask for that. Can again they order a reimbursement of, a psychological evaluation? Sure. Again, maybe compensatory education. So that's something.
Yeah.
I don't know if you hear that, but that's, we deal with that a lot too. Um,
But what I think I'm hearing is that okay, so sometimes it's a case of okay, the school has agreed to do this, okay, and it's creative, right? And it gets us kind of way, and if we go further, we could get nothing,
Yep.
right? Or we could get this that's under the law that's maybe not as good as this. It's almost like, any other kind of negotiation, you have to weigh that, and you support families to do that.
I do. Yep. And we do settlements with families sometimes in schools, because, so you're talking about maybe an outside placement or moving, going to a different school. So, I never want to tell a family to move their house, right? Or move their,
Yeah.
where they're living. Do families sometimes do that? Sure. Right. And we have discussions about that in terms of districts and places for their child. We actually have quite a few e-schools, online schools in Ohio that are tuition free. So that's not a bad option sometimes, but again, talking through that based on their child, right? Because a lot of those
Yeah.
schools still would have to service a 504 and IEP, but if they're totally virtual, right, then maybe they can't do cooking, with somebody who's in a transition goal or something. But we negotiate with schools. We sometimes get settlements, and sometimes what that is, that the child is going to be going to a different school, and the school is going to pay for that, right?
Hmm.
And so you can either get that as an IEP team decision if truly the district cannot support that young person and that IEP, their needs. Then the district would be contracting and paying another school or outside provider for that. And then other times it's just part of an agreement. Maybe the school says, "Hey, we think we can do this," right? And the parent said, "Well, we've had you been trying for a few years, and we don't feel like it's going well." Then we're kind of negotiating more of a settlement. For, I say sometimes everybody just needs to part ways for a while, Logan, and that's okay.
Hmm. So it sounds to me, so like, the part that people think lawyers do is that arguing and all of that. But it sounds to me like most of your practice is right where you want it to be, which is, my law partner, Derek Graham, says that conference rooms are better than courtrooms. And so most of your work is done in a conference room or by phone or by email, helping people realize that this is what you have the ability to do. And here are your rights. Now let's go and get as close to what you want as we possibly can. Where either both parties end up walking away saying we didn't get everything we wanted, but we got something we can live with, and we're better than we were before.
Yep, that's exactly right. Yep, and just always bring it back to that young person, right?
I love that. I love that. That
It's
yes.
so important. And I always say too, as we're going through the process, sometimes I have to stop and say, have we asked the student, right? Have we asked them about the schedule change? Have we asked them about getting a full-time aide? Because sometimes, a family says, oh, well, I want a full-time aide for my student. And again, absolutely, there are students out there that is, what we call their least restrictive environment, their LRE, like that is a need, right? That is something in their IEP that they do need, and we want to make sure we ensure they have that. But other times, I think families feel like maybe a full-time aide would be helpful, and I've been a part of so many situations, where that actually isn't maybe as helpful as you would think, because now you have another adult, right, who, again, the training is different based on the district. And I think everybody goes into education to help kids, but again, that, if they don't have a background in some of these things, and it's a more challenging kiddo or behaviors, maybe an aid is not the best thing. And it's almost like sometimes I feel like, then they're just documenting all the things that the student's doing,
Mhm.
behavior wise. And I always have to take a step back and say, okay, I had one recently where there was, the aide was saying that, my client, my student, who's in elementary schools, was ripping up erasers and throwing them at classmates, right? And they're saying, oh, his behavior's, so out of control. And I said, okay, well, was he the one doing that, or was there other kids? They said, oh no, his whole table. Well, that to me, that's not necessarily disability related, right? That's just a behavior that all the four kids sitting at the same table were doing. So why should my kid with a disability get, kind of targeted or dinged on that, when that was just a pretty typical fourth grade behavior, right?
Yep. Love
So,
that.
it's really fun. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I love what I do. This is literally why I went to law school, to do this work. And like you said, always, being in a conference room is so much better than court. And even when I have court cases, my goal, most of the time, is to try to get those bumped into the conference room, because even with, criminal juvenile defense, oftentimes I can get something bumped to diversion or help the court understand, why this would have happened. And that this is a student with a disability and they have an IEP, or maybe we're working on getting an IEP. So I don't want it to totally derail this young person's future and abilities. And, I always try to get their cases, what we say, dismissed. So, cleared out, but then ultimately sealed and expunged. And the expungement is really huge for young people, because then it means that their entire, those charges, anything that was out there, is wiped clean. There's nothing there. So by the time they go, on to next steps for post-secondary education, or career or military, there is nothing there. So they get to answer, have you ever been in trouble? And nope, I have not, because there's nothing there.
Awesome. So I'm so grateful that you took some time today to speak with me and my viewers. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Logan. Please like, share, and subscribe so you can stay up to date with some of the latest news in the disability community.